Welcome back to the forgotten frontier where the snow still hides names America tried to erase. If you were standing there that morning in 1890, would you have raised the flag of truce or the rifle? Tell me in the comments what you think peace looked like that day. December 28th, 1890, Changkapeopi Wakpala, the creek the Lakota call Wounded Knee, deep in the snow-stricken plains of South Dakota. The wind moves low over the ground, dragging a skin of frost across the bodies of sleeping ponies. Every hoofprint fills with ice. The world here feels hollow, a silence so complete that even the crows refuse to speak. Before dawn, the blue-coated soldiers of the 7th Cavalry line the ridges, their breath rising in white ghosts. The barrels of their rifles glint like frozen veins of iron under the first gray light. One officer checks his watch, 8:30 a.m. The air cracks when he snaps it shut. Across the clearing, a cluster of tippies shivers in the wind. Inside Miniconjou and Hunk Papa families are waking mothers wrapping infants in buffalo robes, elders whispering the old prayers beneath their breath. Some still believe the sacred shirts sewn in the rhythm of the ghost dance can stop bullets. Some only hope it's true. A drum lies, overturned in the snow, its rawhide torn, its voice gone quiet. A small boy picks it up, presses it to his chest. On the hill above, a bugle falters in the wind. Two worlds face each other now, one born from conquest, one born from memory. Between them, a strip of frozen earth, no wider than a riverbed, no thicker than the breath between peace and annihilation. One motion, one misunderstood gesture, and it will begin. The smoke will rise, the guns will answer, and the name Wounded Knee will be carved into every American tongue. History does not whisper here. It waits. And when the first shot cracks through the cold, the map of the plains will change forever, not by treaty or ink, but by the snow turned red beneath the morning sun. So where are we now, standing on the edge of the Republic's memory? Or in the very heartbeat of its forgetting? Before the gunmetal morning of Wounded Knee, the land itself had already begun to splinter. To understand that frozen valley in December 1891, must trace the cracks that had been spreading for decades, invisible at first, then widening until whole nations fell through. The Lakota called their homeland Hisapa, the Black Hills, sacred ground, where the earth rose like prayer. But in 1868, a treaty signed at Fort Laramie promised that land to them for all time. Within 6 years, that promise dissolved. The discovery of gold in those same hills turned treaties into scraps of paper carried by the wind. The miners came first, then the soldiers, then the surveyors, unrolling maps that ignored rivers' burial grounds, the very names of places. The Black Hills became Dakota territory, and the Lakota Nation, once stretching over 100 million acres, began to shrink like skin pulled tight over bone. By the 1880s, the machinery of assimilation was in full motion. Washington had found a new weapon, not rifles or cannon, but legislation. The Dawes Allotment Act of 1887 sliced communal land into parcels each to be held individually by native families. To the lawmakers, it was progress. To the Lakota, it was a knife. What had once been shared hunting grounds, grazing routes, water was fenced, divided, sold to settlers. Within 3 years, the Great Sioux Reservation was reduced by more than half. Pine Ridge, Rosebud, Standing Rock. What had once been circles of kinship became scattered dots on a government map. The new lines were not drawn by rivers or ridges, but by ink, orders, and hunger. The buffalo, the beating heart of plains life, were gone, wiped from the earth in less than a generation. By 1890, fewer than 1,000 remained across all the Great Plains. Without the herd sus, starvation crept like frost into every teepee. Missionaries came too, carrying the Bible and a promise of salvation. Schoolhouses rose beside agency buildings. Children were cut from their families, their hair sheared, their tongues forbidden. The old songs, the old dances silenced. And yet, beneath the surface, something stirred. Across the Western Territories, word began to travel first as rumor, then as hope. A Paiute prophet named Wovoka, far to the west in Nevada, had spoken of a vision, the return of the ancestors, the cleansing of the earth, the coming of a new world where native peoples would live again as before the conquest. His message spread like wildfire through despair. The ghost dance became more than religion. It was resistance through faith, an act of memory disguised as motion. To the Lakota, the dance was a way to breathe life into the ashes. Men and women formed circles under the moon, their arms lifted to the sky, feet striking the earth in rhythm with ancient songs. They wore sacred shirts painted with stars with birds with the power to turn bullets aside, or so they believed. To the U.S. authorities, it looked like an uprising. Agents at Pine Ridge and Standing Rock sent telegrams eastward. The Indians are dancing again. We are powerless to stop them. Newspapers picked up the story, twisting prophecy into threat. The Ghost Dance War, they called it, long before a shot was fired. Panic spread through the frontier towns. Forts were reinforced. The 7th Cavalry, the same regiment once crushed at Little Bighorn, was dispatched once more, this time not to fight an army, but to contain a faith. Yet what Washington could not see was that the conflict was already inside every Lakota camp, the fracture between those who believed the new world was coming and those who knew the old one was already gone. Hunger, fear, prophecy, these were the real weapons now. By early December 1890, tensions reached the edge of eruption. Chief Sitting Bull, long a symbol of defiance, was killed during an arrest at Standing Rock. His death rippled across the plains like thunder. Families fled south toward Pine Ridge, seeking refuge under Chief Bigfoot, a man once known for peace, now limping through blizzards, with his people chased by soldiers. They carried their sick, their children, their hope that perhaps the ghost dance might still call down mercy. But mercy was not coming. The U.S. Army encircled the camps under the pretext of disarmament. The newspapers called it restoring order. The Lakota called it the end of breathing space. By the week of Christmas, the reservation system had become a cage. Traders refused credit, rations were cut, the government withheld food shipments. The blizzards sealed the plains. Disease and hunger finished what treaties had begun. And yet, in the frozen heart of Pine Ridge, song still rose into the night. The ghost dance still circled slow and unbroken feet, marking the rhythm of resistance on ground that no longer belonged to them. The map of America in 1890 was drawn to look complete, its borders fixed, its colors uniform. But beneath the ink, the land still remembered its old names. And in that memory, a storm was gathering. The forces were set, a government blind to faith, a people clinging to the last thread of their world, an army carrying both vengeance and fear. The collision was inevitable. The frontier had not ended. It had only changed shape. And at a frozen creek called Wounded Knee, those invisible lines between faith and fear, power and survival, were about to turn red. They called him Spotted Elk, but in the Lakota tongue, he was Sithanka, or Bigfoot. Born near the Black Hills around 1826, he was of the Miniconjou band of the Lakota Sioux, not a warrior by hunger for battle, but by necessity. The son of a peace chief, he grew up watching the horizon shrink as the treaties were signed and broken one after another. In his youth, he hunted buffalo across the Powder River country. In his old age, he hunted rations across the reservation line. He was not tall despite the name. Those who met him in the agency reports described him as broad, deliberate, and step-dignified. He walked with a stiffness in his right leg, a lingering pain from years of cold and travel that would follow him to his final day. Yet, in council he spoke softly, his words slow and measured, as if every phrase carried the weight of those who could no longer speak. Bigfoot's life had been built around one conviction: survival through peace. After the shock of Little Bighorn, when the Lakota world convulsed under the iron retribution of the U.S. Army, he urged his people to lay down arms to find life within the lines of the reservation. He believed, perhaps naively, that coexistence might still be possible if they obeyed the rules written in Washington's hand. But each passing year taught him how paper promises crumble faster than tippy poles in wind. His village at Cheyenne River Agency became a place of uneasy refuge. Thin rations, sick children, broken spirits. The buffalo were gone, the fields yielded nothing but dust, and the government's word meant less than the snow that fell in June. When the ghost dance arrived from the west, it did not come to Bigfoot as rebellion. It came as prayer. He watched the dancers with quiet eyes, young men circling in trance, mothers singing to spirits they hoped would feed their children. To him, it was not madness, as the newspapers claimed. It was memory, the last bridge between the living and the lost. And yet, that bridge was seen as threat. By late 1890, federal agents branded the movement dangerous, and soldiers were dispatched to quell it. Bigfoot's name was added to a list of troublemakers, not for anything he had done, but for what he represented: leadership that still held the loyalty of starving men. In December, when word came that Sitting Bull had been killed during his arrest, Bigfoot knew the frost had turned to danger. His camp at Cherry Creek erupted in fear. Women packed quickly, binding food and robes to sleds. Warriors argued whether to flee or to fight. Bigfoot chose neither. He gathered his council, raised a trembling hand, and said, "We will go to Pine Ridge. We will place ourselves under Red Cloud. There will be peace there." But peace was a word that no longer had meaning on the Dakota Plains. The journey south was slow: 38 men, 152 women and children, their horses thin, their feet wrapped in rags. The cold bit deep. Bigfoot himself was coughing blood pneumonia, tightening its grip on his chest. Still, he rode upright, on a gray pony wrapped in a heavy buffalo robe, his face drawn but steady. Agency scouts who followed wrote that he carried a white flag of truce tied to a stick. It fluttered weakly in the wind, crusted with ice. Along the way, he stopped to speak to children to calm them. He carried with him a small medicine bundle, feathers, sage, and a carved wooden pipe that had belonged to his father. Witnesses said he kept it close tucked under his robe. It was both relic and reminder that the old ways might yet protect them, even as the new world closed in. Bigfoot feared only one thing: that the army would mistake faith for revolt. And that fear, unheeded, would prove prophetic. When his column was finally intercepted by Major Samuel Whitside's detachment of the 7th Cavalry near Porcupine Butte, he did not resist. He raised his hands. He showed the white flag. He asked to be escorted safely to Pine Ridge. The soldiers agreed in words, but their eyes said otherwise. They surrounded the camp, counting rifles, watching every movement. That night, Bigfoot lay coughing under the canvas of a borrowed army tent, snow drifting through the seams. He whispered to his nephew, "Tomorrow we will rest." He believed it, perhaps, or needed to. He was not a prophet like Wovoka, nor a warrior like Crazy Horse. He was something quieter, a bridge between surrender and defiance, between the memory of freedom and the machinery of removal. He carried the weight of both worlds on his shoulders, knowing neither would survive the dawn. At Wounded Knee Creek, his name would outlast him. Sithanka, Bigfoot the chief who tried to walk his people through the storm, waving a flag that the wind refused to see. December 28th, 1890, the Dakota Plains were already a wound of wind and silence. Bigfoot's band had marched for days through snow that swallowed their tracks, each night colder than the last. They had reached Porcupine Creek, barely 40 miles from Pine Ridge, when a line of soldiers appeared over the ridge, the 7th Cavalry riding in formation, their horses steaming in the morning frost. Major Samuel Whitside rode at the front, his breath turning to fog around the brass buttons of his coat. He raised a hand, the order to halt. The Lakota column stopped too. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Bigfoot, wrapped in a buffalo robe, raised his white flag. The flag was real, recorded later in the Army reports, a piece of white cloth fixed to a staff held aloft by the chief himself. Whitside approached slowly, revolver at his side, eyes scanning the faces in the wagons. The Lakota were exhausted women, carrying bundles, children coughing, men too weak to stand. Bigfoot's breath rattled in his chest. He was dying from pneumonia. He told Whitside through an interpreter, "We do not want trouble. We go to Pine Ridge to seek peace." Whitside nodded, then gave orders for the band to be escorted under guard. For their protection, he said. But the protection came with bayonets. The soldiers herded the Lakota to Wounded Knee Creek, a narrow valley cut by drifts of snow and shadow. There they were told to camp for the night. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped below zero. Soldiers set up Gatling guns on the surrounding ridges, not aimed at the horizon, but at the encampment below. The Lakota gathered around small fires too weak to argue. One young mother tore her shawl in half to wrap her baby. A boy asked why the guns were pointing at them. No one answered. Inside his tent, Bigfoot lay under army blankets, coughing blood into the snow. His nephew later said he asked only for rest. Outside, soldiers laughed quietly, sharing whiskey, their voices muffled by the wind. Morning came sharp and pale December 29, 1890. The bugle sounded. Frost glittered on the barrels of the soldiers' rifles. Captain George Wallace of Company E called out the order. Bring them in. Take the weapons. The Lakota were assembled in a line. Men on one side, women and children on the other. Interpreter Philip Wells, who stood nearby, later wrote that he could see the fear in their eyes. They were surrounded, outnumbered, and knew it. The soldiers began confiscating guns, Winchester rifles, hunting weapons, even old muskets inherited from fathers long gone. Some of the Lakota resisted handing them over. Others pleaded that they had none left. A young man named Black Coyote, reportedly deaf, hesitated. He clutched his rifle tightly. The weapon had been expensive, his only means to hunt. The soldiers moved toward him, shouting. He didn't hear. A scuffle broke out, one hand on the rifle, another on the barrel. The weapon discharged a single sharp crack that cut through the cold like thunder. That was the sound, the spark. In an instant, the valley erupted. Soldiers opened fire. The Gatling guns on the ridge began to spin, spitting a stream of bullets into the circle of tents. Mothers threw themselves over their children. Men dove into the snow unarmed, trying to crawl for cover. Bigfoot, still sick in his tent, was among the first to fall. The white flag dropped beside him, stained dark. Within minutes, the snow turned red. The wind that had carried songs now carried screams. By the time the firing stopped, the world that had begun at Fort Laramie in 1868, the promise of peace, of shared land, of coexistence, was over. It was not a war. It was not even a battle. It was a misfire that became a massacre. And it began with one cough, one flag, one rifle that should never have gone off. That morning at Wounded Knee Creek, the fuse of history burned down to its end, and the silence that followed would last a century. December 29th, 1890, the valley of Wounded Knee Creek lay under a lid of gray sky, the air brittle and still like the pause before an echo. It was just past 8:00 a.m. when the first line of Lakota men was ordered to sit in the snow. The women and children were gathered beside the wagons, their blankets bright against the white drifts, yellows, reds, the soft brown of buffalo hides. To the east and west, soldiers of the 7th Cavalry formed a wide horseshoe around them. Rifles leveled, blue coats stiff with frost. The terrain itself was a trap, a shallow basin carved by the slow bend of the creek. The banks rose into low ridges of snow, perfect for cover, perfect for encirclement. The Lakota camp lay in the hollow center, exposed to every direction. Above them, on the northern slope, 2 Hotchkiss guns waited, their barrels angled down toward the tippis. Each could fire 50 rounds a minute, the mechanical heartbeat of empire. The Army's objective was simple, written plainly in the orders of Colonel James Forsyth, disarm Bigfoot's band. Ensure compliance, remove all threat. To the soldiers, it was procedure, a check, a confiscation, a show of control. To the Lakota, it was the end of the world, drawn in straight lines. The morning light was weak, filtered through sheets of ice fog. Interpreter Philip Wells, half Lakota himself, later said, "The sun was rising red, the kind of red that tells of blood." When the first rifle discharged that single accidental shot from Black Coyote's hands, the echo bounced off the frozen ridges, confusing direction. Some soldiers thought it came from the Lakota line. Others thought it came from behind. In panic, someone shouted, "Fire!" The Hotchkiss guns answered. A scream rose, then another, then the valley became sound itself. At ground level, history was chaos. The soldiers fired blindly into the mass of people. Bullets cut through the canvas walls of tipis. Children fell beside cooking fires. Ponies screamed and broke their tethers, charging into the white. The women tried to shield the young with their own bodies. The smoke from rifles mixed with the steam of breath until the air itself looked a live gray, shifting full of ghosts. The Lakota men, many unarmed, some with knives, a few with hidden rifles, tried to return fire. Iron Hail, who would survive, remembered we were shot down like buffalo. We ran wherever there was snow. A few broke through the southern edge of the circle, scrambling toward the creek bed. The ground was uneven, pocked with ice. They slipped, crawled, slid down the bank, and still the guns above tore the air apart. One soldier recalled watching the Gatling sweep like mowing a field. The terrain that had promised refuge now betrayed them. The creek bed was a funnel, no trees, no rocks, just shallow snow and the open sky. The soldiers on the ridge had the height. Their bullets fell like sleet. The only cover was the bodies already fallen. Halfway through the chaos came the pivot, the moment when confusion turned to annihilation. A company of cavalrymen, believing the Lakota were rising up, advanced into the camp to secure it. They fired point blank into tents where people were hiding. One gun jammed, another overheated, its barrel glowing red. Horses trampled bodies, wagons overturned. The smell of black powder thickened until breathing felt like swallowing smoke. On the western slope, a sergeant shouted "Cease fire," but his voice was lost in the roar. Orders dissolved. Fear took command. Down by the creek, a group of Lakota women and children tried to cross the frozen water. The ice cracked beneath their weight, a sound like glass breaking. They fell through cold, swallowing their cries. Others reached the far bank, climbing toward the hills. The soldiers followed on horseback. Witnesses from the 7th later admitted, "We fired until the barrels were too hot to hold." Among the chaos, Bigfoot's tent lay collapsed under snow. Inside, the chief's body was found. After the firing stopped, face turned toward the sky, his white flag still beside him. A bullet had entered through his ribs, exiting clean. His body was later frozen in the position of surrender, one hand raised, as though still pleading for peace. The battle, if it can be called, that lasted less than an hour. But its geography made it eternal. The terrain dictated the slaughter, a ring of guns, a bowl of snow, a people with nowhere to go. When the guns fell silent, soldiers began walking the field. They found bodies sprawled across a 3-mile radius, men, women, infants, even dogs cut down. Some Lakota had tried to crawl toward the ravines. Others had run into the willows. The snow was tracked with blood and footprints that led nowhere. Captain Charles Eastman, a Dakota physician called to the scene days later, wrote, "I counted the bodies of 72 women and children. Some had babies still tied to their backs. The snow had fallen again and covered them as if the earth itself wished to hide what had been done." Forsyth's men gathered the surviving Lakota, about 150 souls, many wounded, shivering. They burned the remaining tipis, their flames snapping against the pale wind. In the smoke, the ridge guns stood motionless, silent now, but still aimed at the earth. For the Army, the engagement at Wounded Knee would be called a victory. Official reports claimed it was necessary, justified, inevitable. For the Lakota, it was the sound of the world ending. The decisive factor had not been numbers or weaponry, but geography, a bowl in the snow that became a grave. The creek meant to shelter a winter camp turned into a killing ground. The cold froze the dead where they fell. Preserving their last gestures, arms raised, faces turned skyward, frozen prayers that history would take a century to thaw. By noon, the valley was still again. The smoke lifted. The wind resumed its quiet work of erasure. Only the sound of crows remained circling above the ridge. Wounded Knee was over, but the map of America had shifted once more. A people's border had been erased not with ink or treaty, but with powder burns and footprints pressed into snow. And in that silence, the land remembered everything. When the gunfire faded, the cold did not. The valley of Wounded Knee was silent again, except for the wind moving slowly over the snow, brushing against the shapes that no longer moved. The soldiers gathered what they could, but the sound that lingered was not the orders or the bugle. It was crying high, thin, unending. The killing had lasted less than an hour, but the aftermath would stretch for days. The 7th Cavalry was ordered to secure the site and pursue any fleeing hostiles. They rode out along the creek's frozen bends, rifles still hot scanning for movement. In the gullies and shallow ravines they found survivors' women clutching children under torn blankets, some wounded, some half frozen, some too afraid to raise their heads. A few had crawled miles through the night, leaving trails of blood that the wind could not yet erase. Private Thomas Sullivan later wrote in his diary, "We found them huddled together, half buried in the snow. They did not speak. One woman had a baby still alive on her back, the rest of her stiff as a board." He added nothing more. As night fell again on over the creek, the soldiers dug shallow trenches in the hard earth. They piled the dead in rows, first the men, then the women, then the children. An army surgeon described stacked forms frozen solid, impossible to bend. The blizzard that followed sealed the horror beneath a crust of white. For the Lakota who had escaped, the few still breathing, the march did not end. They fled south toward Pine Ridge, stumbling through waist-deep snow, led by those strong enough to carry the wounded. Among them was Iron Hale, who had been shot in the leg. He later said, "The snow was red behind us. The night was blue ahead. We walked between two worlds." They walked without shoes, without food, guided by the dim glow of fires on the horizon, the same fires that burned their camp. Mothers carried infants wrapped in robes stiff with frost. The wind cut their faces raw. At every mile, someone fell behind. No one had the strength to turn back. By the time they reached Pine Ridge, word had already traveled ahead of them, not of massacre, but of battle. Soldiers at the fort were waiting with bayonets fixed. The survivors collapsed before the gates, too weak to plead. The army surgeons moved through them with lanterns, lifting blankets, checking pulses, separating the living from the dead. Some were taken inside. Others were left outside until morning. And inside that compound of wood and iron, the survivors' stories began to drift together, like smoke fragments of the same nightmare, told in different tongues. One woman, too weak to speak, traced shapes in the frost on the floor, circles, spirals, the dance steps of the ghost dance. The interpreter watching her wrote. She kept drawing until her fingers bled. Meanwhile, as on the field they had fled, the soldiers stayed behind to clean the site. 3 days later, on January 1st, 1891, a burial detail arrived, led by Dr. Charles Eastman, a Dakota physician sent by the government. He would never forget what he saw. "I had seen the dead before," he wrote, "but not like this. The snow had covered them as if the earth had tried to hide its shame. We pulled them from the drifts, babies, with their hands still frozen around their mother's hair. Old men clasping broken pipes, women whose faces were turned to the sky. The soldiers dug a mass grave on a low hill above the creek. They lowered the bodies one by one, 146, maybe 300. No one kept count. They covered them with thin earth. Over the pit, the flag of the United States was raised again. The same flag that had flown at Fort Laramie when peace was promised 22 years earlier. Down in the valley, the snow began to fall again. The sound of it, soft, steady, unending, was the only mercy left. That night, a survivor named Sintkala Nuni, the lost bird, was found alive beneath the body of her mother. She was barely 4 months old. A soldier picked her up, carried her back to camp. She would grow up in a white family, her Lakota name turned into English. She would die young, never fully knowing the language of the songs that had once surrounded her. Every face, every small motion from that day lived on in memory, in silence and absence. The army returned to its posts. The reports were filed. The snow melted, revealing the bones that had been missed. But for the Lakota, life did not end at Wounded Knee. It bent, twisted, and kept moving. Those who survived built new camps on the reservation edges. They carried on ceremonies, in secret singing the ghost dance quietly at night, without drums, their feet barely touching the ground. The world had changed shape. The open plains were gone. The buffalo were gone. But memory somehow remained stubborn, unkillable. As one elder later said, "They thought they buried us in the snow. They did not know we were seeds." And so, the echo of Wounded Knee did not fade with the wind. It multiplied with each breath of those who remembered. The sound of gunfire turned to a soundless rhythm. Footsteps through time. Carrying stories the government could not erase. Because in the end, the map may change borders, redrawn treaties forgotten, but the ground remembers. It always does. By the time the blizzard rolled back over Wounded Knee, Creek history had already frozen into place. The field lay silent, rifles stacked tense, collapsed smoke still drifting from the wreckage of Tippis. The last official note in Colonel Forsyth's field log was dated December 29, 1894, 30 p.m. It read, "Only one line, camp secured. Engagement concluded." After that, the ledger ends, no signatures, no details, just a smudge of ink where the pen trailed off. The rest of the record is silence. But for the Lakota, that same hour marked the closing of a world, the moment when the old circle of life, the circle of song and season, was shattered beyond repair. What happened at Wounded Knee was not just the death of 300 men, women, and children. It was the death of an idea that coexistence might still be possible, that treaties could still mean anything at all. In the days after the massacre, soldiers dug in against the cold, waiting for orders. They had won, they thought. They had ended the ghost dance. They had secured the frontier. But as the storm deepened, their victory began to look like a burial. The wind erased their footprints. The snow swallowed their campfires. The Army's tents looked like tombstones scattered across a white plain. At Pine Ridge, chaos took its place. Refugees flooded the agency, desperate for food and shelter. Mothers wailed through the nights, calling names into the snow, names that would never answer. The agency clerk, a young man named William Fisk, wrote in his diary, "We cannot sleep for the sound of mourning. It comes through the walls like wind through canvas." Meanwhile, in Washington, telegrams arrived one after another. Sioux outbreak ended, they said. Hostile bands dispersed. The language was clean, deliberate, final. But out on the plains, the echo of gunfire still rolled across the empty hills. No one dared to go back to the creek, not yet. When Dr. Charles Eastman finally reached the site days later, the snow was waist-deep. His horse refused to move forward. He dismounted, wading into the drifts with his satchel of bandages and smelling salts. He expected wounded. Instead, he found only stillness. There was no life, he wrote later. Only the wind and the forms of those who had fallen, their faces uncovered by the storm. One child's mitten lay on top of the snow, stiff and red. A dog circled nearby, crying softly. Eastman's report, the one the government never printed, ended on the last page with a single phrase: "No further treatment possible." That was the medical note. But it was also a verdict on a century. In the weeks that followed, soldiers carried out the final pacification of the Lakota. They disarmed every camp, confiscated sacred objects, banned the ghost dance outright. The songs were declared illegal, the drums were burned. The surviving children were sent to mission schools where they learned new names and new prayers. And slowly, the silence of Wounded Knee spread from the creek to the hills to the classrooms. The great Sioux reservation, once vast as a continent of memory, was broken into fragments. Pine Ridge, Rosebud, Standing Rock, Cheyenne River, islands of survival, scattered across the map. The Dawes Act took what the rifles had not. Within 20 years, the Lakota would lose nearly 90% of their remaining land. The massacre had been meant as an ending, but it became a boundary instead, the invisible line that divided the past from the present, the age of free nations from the age of remembered nations. Beyond that line, there was no going back. Even the soldiers seemed haunted by what they had done. Private Thomas Sullivan, whose journal survives in a museum today, scrawled one final entry before his unit departed in the spring thaw: "We came to make peace and left ghosts behind." The prairie will not forget. The official record, however, moved on. The War Department cleared Colonel Forsyth of wrongdoing. The newspapers printed columns of praise. And in the spring of 1891, 20 soldiers were awarded the Medal of Honor for bravery in action at Wounded Knee. The medals gleamed bright against their blue uniforms, reflecting light that had never touched the snow where the dead still lay. Somewhere between the ink and the silence, the old America ended. The frontier was declared closed. The census of 1890 noted that there were no longer any significant areas of unsettled land. But that word unsettled hid what had truly happened. It wasn't the land that had been settled. It was the memory. That is the moment the door closed. The point from which there was no return, not for the Lakota, not for the nation that had chosen to forget. From that day on, Wounded Knee ceased to be a place. It became a symbol, the shorthand for what conquest costs when it outlives reason. The U.S. Army would never again fight a large native force. The wars were over, yes, but peace was nowhere to be found. The last breath of the old world hung over that frozen valley, a silence that no treaty could break, no metal could polish away. When spring finally came, the snow melted into the creek. The water ran red for a time, then brown, then clear again. The land absorbed it all, the bullets, the ashes, the footprints, the names. And when it was done, the earth closed its mouth. History had spoken its last word on the frontier. But the echo of that word, Wounded Knee, would never stop traveling. In the months after Wounded Knee, the snow melted, but the line it carved across history did not. The massacre was over. The war reports filed. Yet every year that followed traced its shadow, widening it across generations. 1 year later, 1891, the U.S. government declared the Sioux disturbances officially ended. The Department of War congratulated the frontier posts for restoring peace. Colonel Forsyth, suspended for a brief inquiry, was reinstated with full honors. Not a single officer was charged. At Pine Ridge, the surviving Lakota buried their dead in silence. The ghost dance was outlawed. Tribal police were ordered to arrest anyone seen performing it. Mission schools expanded. Indian agents boasted of rising attendance. Children were taken from their families to Carlisle Indian School in Pennsylvania and to St. Francis Mission near Rosebud. There their hair was cut, their clothes burned, their names replaced. One boy, once called Little Elk, became Robert. Another, Zintkala Nooney, the lost bird of Wounded Knee, was adopted by a white couple and paraded as a symbol of redemption. She would die at 29, buried far from her people. 5 years later, 1895. The Great Sioux Reservation, already fractured, was redrawn again. Congress approved the Cut Off Lands Act, allowing more white settlers into former treaty zones. Within the decade, railroads crossed the Dakotas like veins of iron, carrying settlers west and timber east. Towns rose where buffalo bones had once bleached in the sun. Rapid City, Hot Springs, Kadoka, names foreign to the soil they stood on. The Lakota population, counted by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, had dropped by nearly 1/3. Tuberculosis and hunger claimed what bullets had not. The new generation spoke English in public Lakota in whispers. 20 years later, 1910. The world beyond the plains moved into the age of machines, but on the reservations, time stood still. The promise of the Dawes Act, land and citizenship for those who conformed, became a mechanism of dispossession. More than 60% of allotted native lands were sold to non-Indians through surplus sales and tax foreclosures. In Cheyenne River, the descendants of Bigfoot's band lived in scattered shacks, their buffalo replaced by cattle herds they did not own. The U.S. Army had long since moved on, but the border fences remained barbed wire where once there had been wind. Yet amid the silence, resistance survived. The memory of Wounded Knee became a story told in low voices by firelight, a warning and a vow. Old men who had seen the snow turn red would press their palms to the earth and whisper, "It remembers." The map of America looked solid. Now the blank spaces filled the frontiers declared closed. But beneath the ink, the ground still held older lines, the treaties signed, the promises broken, the songs banned but not forgotten. By the 1920s, Pine Ridge had become both a wound and a symbol, the endpoint of conquest and the beginning of awakening. Missionaries called it the place where civilization triumphed. The Lakota called it the place where the ghosts still walk. Then, 70 years after the massacre, 1968, a new generation stood up in the same name. The American Indian movement, AIM, was born calling for sovereignty, dignity, and truth. They carried signs that read, "Remember Wounded Knee." And in 1973, the echo came full circle. Armed protesters occupied the same valley, demanding justice 83 years to the day after Bigfoot fell. Helicopters hovered where Hotchkiss guns had once stood. The U.S. government again surrounded the Lakota, this time with cameras instead of cannons. But something had changed. The world was watching. The ghosts had returned not for vengeance, but for voice. From that day, Wounded Knee ceased to be a battle site. It became a map of conscience, a place where the United States could measure the distance between its words and its deeds. One creek, one morning in 1890, and yet its aftershock redrew a century. Each December, when the wind turns thin and the plains frost over again, riders appear on the horizon, young and old, wrapped in blankets, carrying eagle feathers, their horses moving through the same cold that took their ancestors. It is the Bigfoot Memorial Ride, a 300-mile journey retracing the trail from the Cheyenne River Reservation to Changpe-Opi-Wakpala Wounded Knee Creek. They ride not for spectacle, but for memory. Each hoofbeat marks a name, each breath a prayer. At night, they sleep in barns and church halls, singing the same songs that once circled the ghost dance. The youngest among them carry phones now recording the ride. The oldest carry scars. The past is no longer distant. It travels with them generation to generation. On the hill above the creek stands the mass grave ringed by white crosses and small wind-tattered flags. The earth still heaves slightly in winter, as if a-breathing. Visitors leave tobacco-beaded bracelets, folded notes written in Lakota and English. The sign at the gate reads, simply, "Remember us." The survivors' descendants live today across Pine Ridge Rosebud Standing Rock, in houses built from government blueprints on land parceled by laws older than their grandparents. Yet each community holds a circle for the lost. The ghost dance, once outlawed, is sung again quietly, respectfully at gatherings that blend Christian hymns with ancient rhythms. The drums return not as weapons, but as medicine. In the academic record, Wounded Knee has shifted language. For decades, it was labeled a battle. Then slowly, the term changed: massacre, tragedy, cultural wound. But among the Lakota, there is no need for translation. They still call it Changpe-Opi-Wakpala, the creek where the spine was cut. Not a metaphor, but a geography of memory. The land has absorbed everything. The iron of bullets, the ashes of fires, the songs buried in snow. And yet each element continues to speak through ceremony, through story, through endurance. What does the land remember? That treaties can be broken, but prayers cannot. That names change, but the language of mourning outlasts empires. That even silence carries history, if you listen long enough. Standing at the memorial, one hears not only the wind, but the murmur of both tongues, Lakota and English, weaving together across a century of loss and reclamation. The two languages do not erase each other. They coexist like snow over stone. And that perhaps is the final lesson. Wounded Knee offers that remembrance is not an act of anger, but of accuracy. The slow, patient work of giving names back to the earth that once held them. The snow melted, but the silence of Wounded Knee never did. What do you think? Can a nation truly heal from the stories it tried to bury? Leave your answer in the comments. I want to know how you define remembrance.